You've tuned in to Lesson 3 of Bullseye Soul Connection. In this series, you will learn why the soul is the primary target, why the enemy attacks it with extreme prejudice, and you will learn how to recognize, root out, and disarm any enemy strategies that are lurking in the shadows of your own life. Ultimately, you will receive a surefire battle plan designed to place you back on your path of purpose and ensure that you will realize your God-ordained destiny. Hi, I'm Linda Williams. I'm the founder and CEO of Who's Apple Empowerment Center and the creator of the Who's Apple Dynamic. I have a bachelor's in organizational leadership and a master's of social work. I also have graduate certification in substance and alcohol abuse. I'm a certified Christian life coach, a certified professional life coach, and I am a trained psychotherapist. There are several powerful takeaways from this series. You will learn to recognize, root out, and disarm destiny-destroying mindsets. You will learn the good and the bad as related to your emotions and how to finally control them instead of their controlling you. You'll gain the definitive battle strategy that disarms IEDs and enemy minefields. You'll learn how to wield the powerful weapon you've had in your possession all along. You will learn how to leverage the past to achieve your God-given purpose and destiny. Let's recap Lesson 2. In Lesson 2, we spent considerable time discussing attitude. Attitude determines our life direction, can have a negative impact on destiny when our frames of reference are off, propels us toward or away from our destinies, and can be altered by a single change in focus. In Lesson 2, we also discussed the great debate regarding predestination versus free will. So if you missed Lesson 2, it's important to go back to it before moving forward with today's lesson. In today's lesson, we're discussing anatomy of the soul and the concepts of perception versus perspective. Let's start out on sound theological ground. We always hear about mind, body, and soul. We even hear beautiful songs. But the truth of the matter is that we are three-part beings, but we are body, soul, and spirit. The body is the earth suit. Our soul and our spirit reside within the earth suit. But our souls engulf the spirit. The spirit is the part of us that communes with God, that relates to God. When we leave this earth, the earth suit stays behind, and the soul and the spirit move on into eternity. So today we're not going to discuss the body. We're not going to discuss the spirit so much as we're going to discuss the soul. Because as goes the mind, so goes the soul. And as goes the soul, so goes everything else. Your soul is three parts: mind, will, and emotion. Again, it encapsulates our spirits. We're going to discuss mind, will, and emotion. The mind. The mind is the human consciousness. It originates in our physical brain, and it's manifested especially in our thoughts, our perceptions, and our emotions. It also includes our memories, our imagination. Now the will. The will is defined as the mental faculty by which one deliberately chooses or decides upon a course of action. It's the act of exercising your will. In lesson 2, we did a lot of talking about free will and free choice as it relates to predestination and emotions, the third part of the trilogy. A mental state that arises spontaneously rather than through conscious effort. It's often accompanied by physical changes or a feeling. The feeling is the emotional part, and the physical changes are driven by the emotion and manifested in a physiological condition. For instance, some of us can tell when we're getting angry or when we're embarrassed by a flush in our face. Some of us can tell that we're getting upset about something by our heartbeats. When people have panic attacks, they're experiencing very strong physical responses to some past memory or some past trauma. It's almost like you can't separate the response of your physical being to an emotion. It's also defined as being a part of the consciousness that involves our feeling. It is our feelings. So let's talk about this chain reaction that occurs when we perceive something. Remember in lesson 2, we talked about the plane coming in at a landing and that it had to be determined by a frame of reference. The frame of reference being the terrain. So the pilots have to have some way of determining where that plane is in relation to the ground. And remember, we talked about the ground being the standard of truth and how that ground is not moving for pilot error, nor is it going to move for us. And this is the process by which we go through a response to an event. The event happens. Now, an event is an event. It could be a rock on a doggone table. The event is what it is. But we all respond to that what it is event in different ways that are completely driven by everything we've been through, experienced, and learned in life. This is an impactful process because this is where we influence negatively or positively our harvest. The reap what you sow. Whatever you do, you will reap. This is part of that entire process. And harvest is so key to our destinies. Whether or not we ever see our destinies is fully driven by this event response chain reaction. But we're going to talk about what happens between the event and the response. Because once you've responded to an event, you've already set in motion your outcomes or your ultimate harvest. And we need to nip this thing in the bud in between the event occurring, our observing it, and the way we respond to it in order to affect our ultimate outcomes or what we call our harvest. So let's discuss this detonation point. The detonation point, the ignition point, begins with a thought that triggers an emotion that drives a response. Did you see that? The thought triggers an emotion, which triggers a response. Now, the thought, I think that we really, when we see this word, we think that it's a conscious thought, that we had to see it coming, that it's knocking on the door and letting us know it's on its way or it's at the door. That is not the case always. These thoughts are embedded in our very souls. These thoughts are emanating from a place so deep within us sometimes that we're fully unaware that we're even having the thought. So we get into this chain reaction dynamic where the same types of circumstances, personalities, people, places, or things, we automatically, as if on autopilot, are responding to them with no thought, excuse the pun, of the thought that's driving the emotion. Now, these thoughts are tied to things that are embedded in our soul. Every time we go through a trauma, a pain, a hurt, a negative experience, it will impact our souls because it's as if it's placing a scar in it. Now, as we develop these mechanisms inside to try to rectify that on our own, we wind up developing and morphing into people that we are not. So, this thought is not necessarily conscious, and we're not necessarily aware of exactly why we're reacting with a certain emotion to an event. But being on autopilot in this regard is just as bad as if somebody was coming in for a landing with a plane on autopilot. That you just don't do. Okay? So we're going to talk about this thought, emotion, and response dynamic. Now back to this event response and harvest dynamic. What we just talked about with the thought and emotions process occurs in between the event and the response. And this is where we have to be very much aware of our perspectives and perceptions. Because the perspectives and the perceptions are piloting that plane. And we get into autopilot with this thing to the point where we don't even consider that we might not have a proper frame of reference. As I said previously, no pilot will bring a plane in for a landing in autopilot. We've already discussed it that ground is not going to give or change if the pilot is his frame of reference is off, and that the truth is not moving to accommodate what I call our stinking thinking. So let's talk about this chain reaction dynamic from a perspective and perception standpoint. Perception and perspective are two words that are so closely related that sometimes we might think that they're the same. But our perceptions and our perspectives really are being seen through dirty lenses of our past. So, what is perception? It's how we perceive the event that is what it is. It's our interpretation of that event. And it's fully based on our past experiences, including the bad things that happened to us. It's based on our internal expectation that we've drawn within ourselves very deeply as a result of that pain. It's based on our past knowledge, our knowledge that could be the way you were raised. You might have seen certain behaviors in the household that as a child became just the norm for you, and you had no reference point by which to determine that it wasn't right. It's all based on our self-concept, the things we tell ourselves or feel about ourselves internally. Now, when you look at this picture, what do you see? There are so many different ways to look at this picture. It's a weird looking picture, I'll give you that. But from one way that you look at it, it looks like the man is facing you and looking at you directly, straight in your face, with a white area to the right. Another way you look at it, it looks like they've distorted his face, but he's looking off to the right. This is an example of perception. Now, the whole concept of perception versus reality, we say that a lot in management when we're talking about being change agents or some cultural change, or maybe it's a trouble area, an outlier in our data where certain area in the mission field is not really performing or has certain personnel issues, and we'll say perception is reality, as if to say that if that employee perceives that that manager is off, wrong, or whatever, then that's the reality that we're dealing with. But that's not true, because remember, the event is what it is, and how that employee perceives that manager really is their own reality. And it's their own responsibility to ensure that their own reality is lining up with the truth of the event that is what it is. Perception is the reality on which our current and future life harvest is created. In between the event and the response and all the things we've gone through, perception is the way that that thing affected us, the way we saw that thing. And it's how you perceive the world around you. It's your backstory. Here's another picture to look at. Now, it looks like somebody, to me, you can look at that and you can see where a guy's looking at you with his sunglasses on. You can see the cameraman in his lenses, and somebody put an ace deuce kind of sideways sitting vase over the picture. The other way to look at it is that there's two faces looking at each other from the side. Again, we have perception. And some people may see both of those aspects of this photo, or some of them may not. You can sit here all night and not see it. That's how perception is. That picture is what it is, but the way each of us sees that picture, perceives that picture, will be different based on our own life experiences. It can be distorted by pain of the past. But perception, the way we see this picture, the way we see an event, the way we see life, determines our perspective. This is where they connect. You have to perceive something before you can draw a conclusion about that something. You see this thing, I'm seeing it A, B, C. Somebody else is seeing it C, D, E. To each of those persons, that's very real to them, the way they're seeing that. But the truth somewhere in the middle of that is what we're trying to establish in any given situation. So what is perspective? It's the conclusions you draw from your perception. How you perceive the event that is what it is will drive the perspective you have on the thing that is what it is. It's your point of view. And that frame of reference comes back into play here. So perspective is not ruling the world. Your perspective rules your world, because it's the conclusions you draw from how you perceive the world around you. And if your perceptions are off, you're off. Your perspective on anything that happens around you or to you, it's what's driving your attitude, which will determine your altitude and determine whether it's going to be, your life is going to be crash and burn or a smooth landing. Perspective rules our emotions and drives our decisions and our choices. We're still in between the event and the response. All of this is going on subconsciously. It fuels how we respond to all situations, circumstances, people, places, and things. The way you perceive that thing determines your perspective on it, You will make decisions in your life based on that perspective, whether that perspective lines up with truth or not. So if it's based on unrealistic or twisted perceptions, then your conclusions will also be twisted. And if you're responding to something based on a twisted perspective, then you are bound to plant a harvest that you really are trying to walk out of. So I want to give you an example of what this means, what this looks like. So you see these people at a conference table. They're all talking, they're having a meeting. Now what if this rock drops in on the table? Okay? Some people would look at that rock and recoil because to them it's a filthy thing that shouldn't be there. Some people will be curious about it. They'll think it's beautiful because it might remind them of something that went on in their childhood. Yet another person might look at it and want to crack it open to see if there are any of those crystals inside. Everybody's got a different perspective on this event of this rock dropping in on this table. But no one can argue that the rock is just a doggone rock on a conference table. Everybody's reactions to that rock will be different. I'm going to sum up today's lesson very quickly and shortly with this. We don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. We're at the end of today's lesson. Coming up in lesson 4, we'll discuss where are you headed? What are the repercussions of having wrong perceptions, perspectives, and making wrong choices in our lives? We're going to talk about whether or not our attitudes have us know towards stolen vision or purpose and destiny. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. As a thank you for attending today, we'd like to offer you the free gift, Too True to Tell, Why What We Don't Say is Leading Us Down the Path of Stolen Vision. Visit whosapple.org to download your free copy now. And Triple Threat, Vanquish the Enemy. The triple threat includes Too True to Tell, our radio series Sister to Sister, available at whosapple.org, and the book on which the series is based, Whose Apple Is It Anyway?, available now at Barnes & Noble and other bookstores around the country. You may also purchase it at Amazon.com. A lifetime of change is empowered by a single act of courage. Whose Apple Empowerment Center. Visit us today to schedule your free coaching session.